As a 28-year-old man, I am the head of my family. I don't want to brag, but it's a fact. My hard work ethic started when I was 12 years old, mowing lawns in my neighborhood. At 16, when all my friends were getting new cars from their parents, I saved up and bought my own car. I was able to pay for my college education without going into debt and landed a well-paying job in finance, which allowed me to earn a six-figure salary by the age of 26. I mention all this not to brag, but to describe the dynamics of my family relationships. From the very beginning, my parents felt that they had to help me financially, as if it were in their DNA. The eldest son, of course, has to bail you out when you need it. As soon as I got my first real paycheck, they immediately turned to me to help them pay their bills. On the day I received my signing bonus at my new job, my mother called and asked if I could pay their credit cards because, according to her, family should take care of family. They never expressed sincere gratitude that didn't seem rehearsed, nor did they acknowledge the sacrifices I made. On the contrary, when I slipped up, they made me feel guilty and made demands. I had to buy everyone expensive gifts for the holidays. When we went on family trips, I had to pay not only for my own plane ticket, but for the entire trip to Spain. When my father wanted to find a new golf club, it somehow fell to me to make sure he kept his business connections. This right was quite impressive, although I felt I had to help because they were my relatives after all. That was my attitude. My younger brother Nick, a 26-year-old man, is the complete opposite of me. Handsome and charming, he easily gets along with people, but he is completely irresponsible and lazy. He has dropped out of college twice, cannot hold down a job for more than a few months, and spends all his money on gambling and other useless purchases to impress the latest woman in his life. However, to my parents, he is a man in rose-colored glasses. Any failure is presented as a search for himself or a manifestation of his free spirit. My achievements were predictable and went almost unnoticed. I barely got a nod when I made the honor roll, while Nick celebrated his minimal successes with parties, which is absurd, and I can't help but mention it. Even after such blatant favoritism, I was still on my brother's side, hoping that he would eventually learn his lesson. I had to pay his gambling debts 3 times, and in the end, the amount exceeded $20,000. I let him live in my apartment for free for several months after he was evicted, and I used my connections to get him a job, which he, of course, lost. I was, in a sense, a classic enabler, and I was programmed to play that role my entire life. I first met my fiancée, Eleanor, a 25-year-old woman, 7 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday party. I found her very beautiful, the perfect combination of beauty and modesty. She was studying to be a psychologist and hoped to open her own practice one day, and we liked each other. Less than a year later, she moved into my apartment, where I covered most of our expenses so she wouldn't have to worry about money and could focus on her studies. I paid for our vacations, fancy dinners, and even the designer clothes she needed to attend professional conferences and meetings. I thought I was buying our future together. 4 years later, we got engaged, and I was truly happy because I believed I had finally found someone who loved me for who I was. But the dynamic began to change. Eleanor and Nick seemed close from the start, but their relationship began to change. I noticed that she started dressing up too much for family dinners and wearing too much makeup, nothing obviously wrong but still noticeable. I often caught them talking and giggling about some secret joke I didn't know about. During family parties, they could often be seen engaged in serious conversation, apart from the rest of us. When I asked them about their relationship, Eleanor dismissed my concerns, saying she was just giving him sisterly advice. I dismissed my doubts as paranoia and convinced myself that it was good that my fiancé and my brother got along well. I worked very hard, at least 60 hours a week, as our wedding date was approaching and I wanted to secure our future. After the honeymoon, I even planned to surprise Eleanor with a large down payment on a house. However, I began to notice some disturbing changes in her behavior. Eleanor became increasingly attached to her phone, to the point where she turned the screen away when she sent me messages. She started going out with her college friends twice a week. I convinced myself that she was probably under a lot of stress and needed some freedom, considering that she was doing most of the wedding planning. To make up for my absence, I agreed to all her extravagant demands, whether it was a first-class hotel, a honeymoon in the tropics, or a designer dress, and thought it was worth it. Our joint bank account took a big hit, but I figured we could manage after the wedding when Eleanor started working part-time as a consultant. She showed me spreadsheets of wedding expenses and her contributions, and I didn't doubt her. 3 months before the wedding, I came home early one day because my boss insisted that I go home since I was tired. I planned to surprise Eleonora by bringing her dinner, but when I got home, she wasn't there, even though she told me she was going to study because she had an exam. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she went out for coffee. I fell asleep on the couch and woke up around 10 p.m. when Eleanor slowly entered the apartment wearing strange clothes. When I asked her where she had been, she became defensive, saying she needed to relax with friends because of exam stress. I sensed that something was wrong, but decided to keep up appearances. The following week, she was in the shower when her Apple Watch vibrated, notifying her that Nick had sent her a message. It read, "Can't wait to see you again. Just tell them you're drinking with Jessica on Thursday." I froze. I also knew I had to give her some privacy, though I couldn't deny the consequences of her privacy, namely an affair with my brother. I picked up the watch, and the password, it turned out, was my birthday. I unlocked the messages and was met with a flood of revelations. Hundreds of messages sent over several months, photos, and even conversations in which they laughed about how they slept together in our bed when I worked late. Their family weekend trips under emergency circumstances were well organized. Upon further investigation, I discovered alarming withdrawals from my wedding account. Thousands of dollars were missing, uncovered through hotel reservations, elegant dinners, and weekend spa trips, all with Nick. These adventures took place while I was at business conferences or on trips out of state. The more I learned, the more I realized that there were messages between Eleanor and my parents that indicated their collusion. Not only did they know about the affair, but they encouraged it. My mother told Eleanor that I was boring and that she needed someone more interesting like Nick. Showing favoritism, my father said he was glad to see that Eleanor seemed to be a positive influence on Nick. At that moment, holding the phone in my hands and reading between the lines of the deceitful messages from the people I considered closest to me, I felt a sudden clarity. My fiancé, my brother, my parents, the people I trusted, were all plotting against me, spending my money, and building a future in which I had no place. I didn't fly into a rage or cry, but I felt a cold horror spreading through me. These people were leeches, and I opened my eyes to reality. And then I decided that I would no longer be a good guy. As usual, I was ready to become a knight in shining armor and show what happens when you cross a good, reliable person. That evening, I didn't argue with Eleanor. I kept my cool and decided to end it all quietly. The next morning, I made coffee and got to work while she was still asleep. I called the bank and withdrew half of our savings, which was mostly my money, into a secret account that she couldn't access. Then I canceled all the wedding plans, the banquet hall, the food, the disco, the flowers, and the honeymoon reservations. And although in most cases the deposit was non-refundable, I didn't care about losing the money. It was much better than being stuck in an unhappy marriage that would end in a painful divorce. When Eleanor finally woke up, her mailbox was overflowing with cancellation confirmations. The look on her face was priceless as she started panicking and calling vendors, looking at me with complete bewilderment. When she finally asked, "What the hell is going on?" I shrugged and replied, "I don't want to marry someone who cheats on me with my brother behind my back." She pretended not to understand, but her attitude changed dramatically when I showed her the evidence. She went on the defensive, making excuses, saying she was lonely because of my job. It was very hurtful, considering I had been trying so hard to give her the best life I thought she deserved. I refused to say any more and left for work, saying, "Let's talk about this later, I'm already late." All day, my phone was ringing off the hook, mostly from her, but also from my parents and even Nick. I pretended not to hear any of them and let them panic. The messages Eleanor sent ranged from confused to angry, then to false concern, and finally to desperate pleas. My parents demanded to talk about the situation, and I replied with a single message. "Of course we'll talk. Dinner is at 7, family." That evening, I went to get a haircut, and with my new look, went to meet my parents. I was going to ruin their lives, and I was going to do it elegantly. When I walked in, Eleanor was sitting next to Nick at the dinner table, and they both looked anxious and awkward. Mom and Dad were ready to play their parts with concerned but disappointed faces. The table was set as if it were a normal family dinner, which only added to the insult. I didn't wait for anyone to start talking and placed the folder with all the compromising messages, photos, hotel, and bank receipts showing how the money had disappeared on the table. Their faces, when it dawned on them, were priceless. Eleanor's blood drained from her face, and Nick's smugness disappeared. Mom started to panic, and Dad tried to intervene, saying, "Talk like an adult, son. Let's talk." I didn't want to use physical force. I'd never been like that. But something inside me snapped when Nick had the nerve to say, "It's not what it looks like." And before I knew what I was doing, I crossed the table and punched him in the face, feeling his nose crack under my fists. Chaos broke out in the room. Women were screaming, and my father was trying to hold me back. I managed to land 2 more good punches before they pulled me away from him. Nick sat on the floor, holding his nose, which was broken, while I adjusted my tie and cufflinks, trying to regain my composure. I told Eleanor that I was terminating the lease on our apartment, and that she had 72 hours to collect her belongings, after which they would be thrown out onto the street. I turned to my parents, who were still huddled over their beloved wounded son, and told them they would never see another penny from me. No more paying off gambling debts, no more helping them pay their property taxes when they couldn't afford it, and no more family vacations paid for by everyone. I reminded them of the years when I was their lifeline, when they wanted to abandon their irresponsible son, and now that tasty feeding trough was gone forever. Mom started crying and arguing that I was making a mountain out of a molehill and that we could work everything out. My father tried to sound authoritative, as he always did. "Son." Eleanor was still sobbing, and her tears did not elicit any sympathy. Nick was too shaken to add anything meaningful to the conversation. As I left, I said one last thing. From now on, they were all dead to me. No attempts to mend relationships, no reunions, no forgiveness. The years of exploiting my loyalty and generosity were over. I was no longer the second choice and the cash cow for everyone. The silence that followed was sweeter than any sound I had ever heard. They couldn't say anything, couldn't justify themselves, couldn't give a reasonable explanation. Nothing. I told myself that I was leaving with my head held high, got in my car and drove away, never to look back at that house again. In the days that followed, the messages resumed, but in a completely different tone. Eleanor wavered between anger and despair, saying she had made a serious mistake and that Nick had seduced her, as if she had no control over their year-long affair. My parents didn't hesitate to use every manipulative tactic they knew: guilt, shame, family duty, and even threats to tell my relatives that I had mental health issues. Nick was mostly silent, probably still nursing his wounds. I decided not to respond to anything, blocked their numbers, and set up email filters to redirect their messages to the trash. I began the process of severing all remaining financial ties between us. It was like removing a cancerous tumor, painful but necessary for my survival. The hardest part was dealing with our mutual friends. There were those who immediately took Eleanor's side, and there were those who tried to remain neutral, which I also found offensive. Some reached out to me to offer support, which I appreciated but mostly avoided. I never craved pity or platitudes. I was doing just fine on my own. Work was my refuge, and I immersed myself in it, staying late every night and coming in on weekends. Within 2 weeks, I found a lawyer who helped me resolve the issue with my apartment lease, closed all joint accounts and credit cards, changed my phone number, and started looking for a new place to live. For the first time in my life, I was doing what I wanted to do, not what I needed to do to keep the peace in my family or to make them happy. It was a liberating feeling. The next 4 months felt like a strange rebirth. I had never understood people who blossomed after a breakup, but my situation changed quickly once I removed the negative people from my life. I disappeared from their radar, left my old apartment, and moved into a cool loft in the city center. It was more expensive, but worth every penny because I found peace of mind. Eleanor had been draining my bank account, and Nick regularly asked me for money, and my financial situation went from decent to stable almost overnight. I started watching my savings grow instead of explaining unexplained withdrawals over and over again. I took some of that money and updated my wardrobe, bought furniture I liked instead of the IKEA furniture Eleanor insisted on, and even ordered a new car. Work became my main hobby, and all those extra hours I spent working began to pay off. My boss noticed that I had become a more productive employee, and it was amazing how much I could get done without the daily drama. 2 months after the wedding that never happened, I got a promotion and a 30% raise. The financial analyst that everyone thought was too boring was promoted to one of the youngest senior managers in the company's history. I also got into fitness and found an exciting boxing gym owned by a former MMA fighter who didn't believe in easy wins for beginners. Within a couple of months, I lost 33 pounds of fat, gained about 20% muscle mass, and could even defend myself in the ring. For the first time in my life, I was my own boss. I didn't have to feel guilty for bailing Nick out, paying Eleanor's endless bills, or being a lifeline for my parents. It was freedom. I was spending my money on myself. I started making new friends, not the fake ones Eleanor and I were used to, but real ones with whom I shared interests. At the boxing gym, I met guys who invited me to their poker nights, and I reconnected with co-workers I had been too busy to socialize with before. All this time, I didn't keep in touch with my family. They seemed to understand that I was serious about cutting ties, but somehow information leaks out, even when you try to prevent it. Another cousin, with whom I remained on good terms, would occasionally share news with me, inadvertently breaking my rule of not communicating with my family. As it happened, the perfect relationship between Nick and Eleanor fell apart with a huge bang. Reality caught up with them when I was unable to support them financially. Without my help, Nick became addicted to gambling, which spiraled out of control and led to constant arguments over money. In fact, he started sleeping with prostitutes just 3 months after he and Eleanor officially got together. Karma can be so cruel, right? My parents had their own problems too. Without my financial support, they were forced to cut back significantly on their expenses. My father put his retirement plans on hold, and my mother gave up her membership at the country club. It's a terrible situation, isn't it? I guess I'll be playing the smallest violin in the world. I won't lie and say I was happy to hear about their problems. I can say I'm not proud of it, but I'm telling the truth. After they played with my loyalty for years and treated me like the worst son, I felt a sense of justice when I saw their world crumbling without my support. I thought I was finally free of all the drama, but one evening after a business dinner, I came home and found Eleanor sitting on the floor at the entrance to my new apartment. I couldn't understand how she had found my address. I barely knew this woman who had always been so perfectly dressed and groomed, and now she looked disheveled. Instead of designer clothes, she was wearing mint-colored sweatpants. Her hair was messy and tied up in a terrible net. Her eyes were puffy and red from crying. At first, I wanted to ignore her. How did she find out where I lived? Probably someone at the office had let it slip. I promised myself I would find out who it was and deal with them later. But what did she want? Against my better judgment, I let her into the apartment, mainly because I didn't want a scene in the hallway that would attract the attention of my new neighbors. As soon as the door closed, she burst into tears. She launched into a rehearsed speech about how Nick had changed since they got together, how he had become controlling and abusive, how he had squandered the money she had set aside for rent, and how he had cheated on her with several women. She said that when she complained about Nick's behavior, my parents turned against her, saying she was an ungrateful bitch who wasn't good enough for their precious son. Between sobs, she lamented that she had made the biggest mistake of her life by wasting years on a good man, meaning me, and called Nick a piece of trash. With tears in her eyes, she said that she had been willing to do anything to make me happy and asked if we could start over. She insisted that she had realized her mistake too late and that we could rebuild what we had from scratch. Eleanor was remarkable in her courage. She really thought I would welcome her back with open arms, that I would be so desperate and pathetic that I would take her back after everything that had happened, and that her tears would wash away my betrayal. When she finished her dramatic performance, I shook my head, said I was sorry, and then couldn't hold back my laughter. Her confusion was painful. She hadn't expected me to forgive her right away and make up with her in tears. I laid everything out on the table in front of her and reminded her of what she had done, of her betrayal, of her blatant disrespect. You just regret getting caught, and that life with Nick wasn't the fairy tale you imagined it would be, right? I asked. Oh, dear. Did you seriously think I was stupid enough to give you another chance? A few seconds passed, and her pretense collapsed. The tears that had been flowing a moment ago were wiped away, and in their place was a nasty, desperate look. She began spewing phrases about how she would never find anyone like me. I smiled and walked her to the door, saying that I didn't want to find anyone like her. I advised her to focus on finding a job to support herself. I couldn't think of a more satisfying revenge than the sound of the door closing behind her. I thought that would be the end of it. But Eleanor wasn't going to give up. Over the next few weeks, she used every strategy she could think of to get me back. She came to my office with flowers and was thrown out by security. She wrote to me from various new addresses, which I immediately sent to spam, and even used our mutual friends to campaign on her behalf. Those friends quickly became ex-friends. Her subsequent attempts were even more pathetic. The last time she showed up at my new gym, somehow finding out where I worked out. Her devotion was remarkable. She made such a scene that my friend, a mixed martial arts trainer, literally had to carry her out. That was when I filed a restraining order. I should have done it sooner, but part of me couldn't imagine her continuing after such a clear rejection. I underestimated her desire for dignity. After the restraining order went into effect, Eleanor disappeared from my life, no doubt to lick her wounds and find another victim. I heard through the grapevine that she had returned to her parents in Ohio and was telling them that I had emotionally abused her, which was why she had cheated on me. Standard Darvo tactics: denial, attack, role reversal of victim and perpetrator, typical of narcissists. To be honest, I really don't care. Meanwhile, my life was getting better and better. With the promotion came new responsibilities, and I handled them easily, without the daily drama of a toxic relationship. For the first time in many years, I started taking real vacations, going on weekend trips to places I had always wanted to visit. I finally bought the motorcycle I had dreamed of for a long time, but which had previously been too dangerous and unsuitable for my age. For the first time in my life, I was living my life to the fullest. But life has a way of disrupting the peace. Just when I thought all the drama was behind me, Nick and Eleanor's story took a different turn. Even though I managed to stay out of my dysfunctional family's way, their explosion spilled over into my life. And the rumors about the difficulties in Nick and Eleanor's relationship were not exaggerated, but rather underestimated. Now that my cousin, despite my protests, still kept me informed from time to time, relishing the scandal, Nick and Eleanor broke up in the most sensational way. Nick also lost all their joint savings and left Eleanor with unpaid rent and no means to pay it after he left. When she turned to my parents for help, They basically told her it was her problem now. Meanwhile, Nick returned to my parents, and they took him back with open arms, despite everything. Only this time, my parents were forced to pay the price for their decades of poor parenting. My absence when they needed financial help to cover the holes in their budget meant that they had to pick up the tab for Nick out of their own pockets. Nick smelled blood and went for the jugular. Somehow, the facts are unclear, he convinced them to mortgage their paid-off home to invest in a so-called sure thing. It was a typical scam, but they fell for it because the golden boy couldn't do anything wrong. When the business, as expected, failed, they took out another mortgage to cover Nick's gambling losses after a threatening man came to their door, became co-signers on a loan for a luxury car that Nick immediately crashed while driving drunk, and paid his legal fees in a drunk driving case. A series of bad decisions. This time, the punishment was final. Within a few months, my parents, who had previously lived comfortably and belonged to the middle class, were on the verge of bankruptcy. Their home, where they had lived for the past 30 years, was mortgaged. My parents were forced to retire at 65, my father, and take jobs in retail, while my mother had to work in a school cafeteria and take on extra shifts. Nick, for his part, did what he always did when things went wrong. He changed his phone number, blocked his social media accounts, and disappeared, leaving my parents to deal with the consequences of his mistakes. He was probably either dodging loan sharks or hiding out with his latest sucker, whom he had convinced to finance him. I found out about all this indirectly and tried not to show any emotion. They had chosen sides many times, and now they were paying for it. I had fought too long to rebuild my life to get dragged into their drama. However, it seemed that the universe wasn't done testing me yet. Exactly 1 year after I last spoke to my family, my phone rang from an unknown number. In any other situation, I would have sent the call to voicemail. But since I was waiting for a call from a client, I answered and realized it was my mother. "Hello, dear. It's been a long time," she said, and that was an understatement. I was about to hang up, but my curiosity got the better of me. She called and asked if we could meet to talk about a very serious family matter, saying it was urgent. I was ready to refuse, but again, my curiosity got the better of me. I knew what it was going to be about, but I needed to hear it for myself. "Sure. How about tomorrow at the cafe near your office?" I arrived a little early and chose a secluded table with a good view of the door. I ordered coffee and saw them come in. My God, if you had told me that was my parents, I wouldn't have believed you. My father had lost at least 20 kilograms and his hair was thinning. My mother's carefully groomed appearance was completely ruined. She wasn't wearing any makeup, her hair was a mess, and her clothes looked like they were bought at a cheap store. They looked like they had come from hell. When they saw me, they exchanged embarrassed half-smiles. I didn't respond or smile, but simply gestured for them to sit down. My mother tried to hug me, but I pulled away, unwilling to give in to their false affection. "What do you want?" I asked, getting straight to the point. Their story began haltingly with awkward glances and a few tears in my mother's eyes. It seemed that Nick had really gone too far this time. As soon as I cut off all financial ties with him, my parents were forced to deal with his mess on their own. They told me how they were losing everything. The house was mortgaged, their credit history was ruined, their retirement accounts were depleted, their medical bills were mounting, and their car had been repossessed. But as if that weren't enough, Nick disappeared off the face of the earth about 4 months ago, and his last act was to empty their rainy day savings and vanish completely. Dad couldn't even look me in the eye when he pushed a folder across the table filled with pages detailing their financial ruin. Mom resorted to manipulative tears. "We need help, dear. Where else can we go? How much did they need? $80,000, $50,000 to stop the foreclosure process, and $30,000 to pay off the most urgent debts. They had done everything they could. No bank would take them with their terrible credit rating, and none of our relatives could help them. It seemed like I was their last hope. Their disdainful, boring, stable, financially responsible son, whom they had humiliated for years, was their only hope. The irony was almost unbearable. "What terrible mistakes we made," my mother sobbed. "What we said to Eleanor about you, how we handled everything. We were wrong. So wrong." My father finally came to his senses and said, "We didn't see who Nick was. You were always a good son." I almost felt something. Almost. But it wasn't about my feelings. It was about the fact that they got what they deserved and were trying to find a way out. If Nick had come home the next day with a winning lottery ticket, they would have welcomed him with open arms and never mentioned this tearful story of reconciliation with me. "What did I do?" I asked, not opening the folder, not even looking at what was inside and pushing it back onto the table. "Wait a minute. You're the one who got my fiancée to have an affair with my brother. You went and told her I was boring and that she needed someone interesting like Nick. You used me. And then, when I finally broke up with all of you, you kept helping Nick until he ruined you. And now you want me to give you $80,000? My mother's tears flowed even more. "We are still your parents. As they say, family is family no matter what." I couldn't hold back my laughter. "Family is family? That's what you say? Where was that loyalty when you were plotting against me?" And my father made one last desperate attempt. "We're going to lose our house. At our age, we'll be homeless. We have no idea what we're going to do." I stood up, towering over the two pathetic creatures in front of me, the very ones who had shamed me my whole life and were now literally begging me for help. "You should have thought about the consequences when you bet on the wrong son." Mom tried to take my hand, but I pulled it away. "Please," she thought. "Where will we go?" "That's not my problem," I said. "Your decision has been made. Nick is my son too. Go find him and stop wasting my time." With that, I stood up, threw $20 on the table for the coffee and tip, turned, and walked out. Good luck with the eviction. I would have said stay in touch, but I won't. When I looked out the window at them standing outside, the look on their faces was entirely appropriate. I walked to my car feeling lighter than I had in years, without guilt or doubt. People may judge me for being heartless, but it was the best I could do, leaving those two spoiled bloodsuckers behind. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted to find a new master, because their golden child had sucked them dry and abandoned them. I went back to work, turned up the music, and didn't think about them until I sat down to write this post. To be honest, I'm relieved to be the bad guy in their lives because, in mine, I've finally become a good person.